Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to this November meeting of the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code. I'm Mike Romano, Committee Chair. If you were with us yesterday, thank you for being again with us today. And if you're joining us for the first time this morning, yesterday's proceedings will be available on our website and on YouTube soon. We have a busy day today. Here's what's planned. First, I'm very happy to announce that we'll be joined by George Gascon, who is the DA-elect of Los Angeles County. Then we will hear from a panel of 3 advocates about their perspectives on the Penal Code as we begin to close in on our first batch of committee recommendations. After that panel, the rest of the meeting will be discussion by committee members on the parole and resentencing issues that we heard about yesterday. And then we'll have a discussion about the ideas the committee has explored in past meetings and the priorities that we have set for staff. But we'll also take 5-minute breaks along the way as usual. So let me introduce George. I'm very happy that George Gascon is able to join us as this morning's keynote speaker. He's the District Attorney-elect of Los Angeles County. He was elected last week to lead the largest prosecutor's office in the country. Because of the size and prominence of his new office, what happens in LA does not necessarily stay there. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office has significant impacts throughout the state, but also throughout the country. DA Gascon is one of only a few elected officials, along with Gavin Newsom, to publicly support ballot measures and sentencing reforms from 3 strikes to Prop 47, Prop 57, and ending the death penalty. DA, congratulations on your victory. We are eager to hear your thoughts on the committee's work. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael, and thank everyone. I see familiar faces and new faces that I plan to work with in the future, but it's really rewarding to be here with you this morning. I think for some of you that may not know fully my story, I think it will contextually, it will take us to a place where you understand where my recommendations come from at the end. I started in law enforcement. I was with the LAPD. I went through the ranks all the way to run operations within the LAPD. At the time that I was there, was the largest job other than the chief of police. That was every police station, all detective operations. Basically, if it had any kind of enforcement role, it came under operations, and I did that as an assistant chief. And then from there, I went to Mesa, Arizona, where I was the chief of police for 3 years and wound up going to the U.S. Congress to provide testimony against Joe Arpaio, who was then the Maricopa County Sheriff there, concerning the what I considered to be human right abuses that were going on in Maricopa County. And that actually led to my being asked to leave my job because I was bringing too much political pressure to a city council that, by the way, was extremely supportive but very conservative. And the heat was just so intense. And that's how I wound up being recruited by Gavin Newsom. I became the chief of police in San Francisco. And then that's where I got to know Kamala, and the rest is history. I became the district attorney. Through my own personal journey, starting as a young police officer, going through the ranks and then becoming the district attorney, I went through my own evolutions in the system. And I went from a place of, being very much part of the era of mass incarceration in this country, and believing that that was the answer to public safety, to be in now the place where not only do I consider that, it was a horrendous mistake that we made as a nation, but also be someone that now really is aggressively has been working on the other side of the equation, if you will. And one of the things that has become very obvious to me in my own evolution and experimentation and learning and traveling throughout the world too, by the way, I've done work internationally in the Middle East, in Latin America. I'm a fully bilingual Spanish speaker. And also just going and learning tours, going to Europe, spending time in Germany and other parts of the world, is that there is no direct, in fact, there is no correlation at all most of the time between incarceration levels and community safety. In fact, I believe that we in this country, and certainly California led the way, we got to the point where over-incarceration actually created more insecurity than safety, as well as, quite frankly, being, just I believe to be a social failure and an economic failure. Almost any touch point that you want to look at over incarceration is it's impacting our ability to fund education and social services and public health. It has had a very negative impact on many communities to the point that we have broken down one generation after another now for the last 4 decades. And we have seen actually an increase in crime in many areas. While we are definitely at historic lows as a nation, if you compare San Francisco to LA, I think it's a tale of two cities that is really important to compare. And I know that you, especially for those of you that were in the LA area or San Francisco, you hear a lot of the rhetoric that was driven during the elections by the police unions and prison guards. But the reality is this. In San Francisco, we lower incarceration to historic levels. In fact, there was an analysis that was done in 2016, and the conclusion was that if everybody incarcerated at the rates of San Francisco did, we would eliminate mass incarceration in this country in a period of a year. Our jail was consistently 27 to 30% vacant, the only jail in the state that had those figures. Our city grew, and it's a city and county, so the city or county grew by 6% in population during the period of time that I was a district attorney. In fact, we laid ours over my opponent's history. LA County grew by 1%, we grew by 6%. Violent crime in San Francisco went down. Violent crime proportionally in LA County went up by 27% at the same time. Yeah, LA County incarcerated 4 times the rate that we did in San Francisco. And, I was always accused of an uptick in property crimes, which was true. We had an uptick was vastly driven by car break-ins, but what people often don't realize is that we had a police department, the chief of police that eventually was ousted, that decided that they were, because of Prop 47, that were not going to do their job. And we had 81,000 car break-ins and we had 13 arrests. Then we had a new chief of police came in my last 2 years, and within a year and a half, we lowered car break-ins and property crimes by nearly 20%. And that has continued to be the trend, just simply by paying attention to the work and intervening, not necessarily over incarceration, but just intervening with the people that were driving the crime. So I say all this to tell you that I hope, and I know that many of you on this call, I know some of you personally, I know exactly what your thought process is, and here you have been partners in the past in reform, but I would hope that as you're looking at penal code reform, that you keep as your North Star, that we have incarcerated way too much, and that doesn't necessarily support any angle when it comes to public safety. And that if we find a way to reduce the levels of incarceration, we reduce the time that people go to prison when they are sent to prison, we are going to not only help ourselves economically and socially, but we're going to be much more effective in the way that we do our work. And frankly, a lot of that money that we spend in over incarcerating could go to rehabilitative services and reentry services that are more likely to create safety than the contrary. The difference between a 10-year sentence and a 20 or 30-year sentence, frankly, from a public safety stance, most of the time are not going to make any difference. But what it will do is, an additional 10, 15, 20 years in prison, as you well know, is horrendously costly economically, obviously socially as well. And you're taking all that money away, you're sucking it away from places where we could actually have a shorter period of time in prison with more rehabilitation and more and higher quality reentry services. So, I'm coming from the point, and by the way, and again, I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but there are many other nations in the world, and I'm talking about nations that have fairly advanced legal systems where it's very hard to get more than a 20-year period of incarceration, right? And then if you are going to go beyond that, it really has to be driven by, psychological and medical evaluations, someone that may actually continue to be dangerous to others if they were to be released. You have very few countries in the world that have the process that we do of stacking sentencing. Most of the more developed legal systems, if you commit, let's say, 2 murders, you don't get double sentencing, you get 1 sentence for murder. The concept of, status enhancements is very much of an American thing. And it's really something that by and large was developed in the last 30 or 40 years, mostly. So gang enhancements, gun enhancements, a lot of these things really, there's no connection to safety, but what it does is it creates a situation where you may have a base sentence that is, X number of years. And I know Judge Espinosa knows this very well, but by the time that you start stacking up the enhancements, you have double, triple, or quadruple the base sentence. And there's absolutely no connection to public safety in any of this. But what we're doing is we're multiplying the cost of those incarceration cycles exponentially. And that money has to come from somewhere, right? It's coming from education, it's coming from social service, it's coming from medical and health services. So for me, that is what I hope that when you're doing this work, that you're really looking at how do we reduce the periods of incarceration that are driven right now by a penal code that has been mostly crafted in the last 2.5, 3 decades by very regressive policies that have been driven by police unions, by district attorneys, and frankly, by fear mongering, completely disconnected from science and what works. And I think, we're at this wonderful historical moment in our society. I mean, especially in California, if you look at what happened in these elections, right? Prop 20 was completely rejected by the voters, right? And this was really, I would hope, a last-ditch effort by police and prison guards and district attorneys to try to unwind Prop 47, which obviously I have a lot of pride in authorship, but not because it's just something that I work on, but because we've seen that it works, right? But not only that, if you look at LA County voters, they overwhelmingly voted for Measure J, which is also taking funding away from, from incarceration and from enforcement efforts, and start to put money into services, which I personally believe will make our community safer, like mental health services, and intervention, and housing. So I think that there is a perfect storm, meaning that we have, and I mean that in a good way, we have the public sentiment in the state has been way ahead of elected officials and certainly way ahead of police and prosecutors and prison guards for years now. One time after the other, they have voted very clearly and convincingly to reduce incarceration periods. And now we have this moment in history where we can begin to unwind some of the harm that we have caused to so many communities in the last 3 decades, 4 decades. And I think that if we were to start looking at our penal code and really start shaving, getting rid of a lot of the enhancements, going just to your base sentence, I believe that and by the way, this is an area that I know is controversial for some, and I know that it occurred driven actually by progressive thoughts, but I think that we need to take a really good look at determinate sentencing versus indeterminate. I believe, and I've talked to many people in our prison system, and they said the worst case scenario for them is to have a young person that comes in with a determinate sentence because they have absolutely no reason to program, no reason to rehabilitate. They know they're going to be there for a clear period of time, and basically they disengage. Whereas if you have indeterminate sentencing, people then have an incentive to actually begin to program and start working on an exit strategy. And again, I know that this was done with a lot of good faith decades ago, but I think it's time to reevaluate that. I believe that if we begin to reduce the terms of incarceration and we start to take away the tools that unfortunately have been discretionary tools in the hands of prosecutors that I believe have been misused for so many years, and frankly have tightened the hands also of the bench, right? The bench in so many areas would often want to exercise discretion, but they're unable to do so because they have been locked up by this very restrictive legislations that have been driven by policies that were completely driven by a belief that the more incarceration that you had, the safer that you were going to be. I think that we would go a long way, and I believe that California is in this wonderful place where we have a governor that is very interested in sort of marking his place in history. We have legislators that are very progressive. We have the public that is ready for this. And above all, we have science and evidence today, which we did not have in the 80s and 90s. We have actual science that shows that the lengthy periods of incarceration are really completely, they have little utility other than, continue to take money away from so many other areas. So I know that you have a tremendous uh, task ahead of you. I know the penal code is a monster, both in terms of what is written and politically, but I would urge you that if we could get to the point where on a regular basis, even for the most serious crimes, you would never go to prison for more than 20 years and perhaps create some kind of evaluation process at that point. If you have somebody that has proven inside the institution to be continuing to be unsafe, then you can have, every year, every 2 or every 3 year reevaluation. That, but as a regular standard, we stop stacking sentencing, we get rid of enhancements, and we shrink those the periods of incarceration. On the other hand, if we provide more opportunities for diversion in the early stages and funding for divertive type of efforts in the penal code, and give the judges and the bench wider range of options to be able to exercise a higher level of discretion, where they don't have to be, where the district attorneys are not controlling the courtroom as they currently do. I think that will go a long way towards getting us into a much better place as a society, and frankly, giving us the freedom to begin to start shifting resources and funding into the things that make us safer, like, good reentry services, good diversion programs, those things that we know that actually work. So I'm going to shut up there and take any questions that you may have. But I just thought that this was really important for me to tell you just kind of where I come from in this.
Well, George, thank you very much. We really, really appreciate your time. I'm going to ask a very quick question. I don't mean to put you on the spot, and then I do, and I know that you have a hard stop at 9:30. So I know one of the innovations that you brought to the San Francisco office, and something that we are very eager about, is to work on collecting data to evaluate almost everything that we do. We have agreements with the CDCR and special statutes to get statewide data. And I hope that we can count on you and your office to contribute to that data collection process. And we have a lot of expertise here in Silicon Valley willing to help us crunch that for us. So that's something that I'd very much like to work with you on. I hope that you can be cooperative on that, or helpful with that.
Absolutely. View me as a partner. And Michael knows this. When I left San Francisco, and I didn't even realize, my chief of staff came to me and says, as you're leaving today, you know that there are 17 ongoing research projects in the office. And, we became the Disneyland for researchers, and for a good reason, because I really learned so much from this process. In fact, the way that I came around enhancements was I actually brought Stanford Law School, if you recall, Michael, I said, look, let's look at enhancements. And we tried to get other DAs to agree and open out their books. No one did. We were the only ones. But it really opened up a window for me to understand with numbers, not just intuitively, but understand the impact of status enhancements. And that's why I've come to the place, frankly, as a district attorney in LA, I will stop seeking gang enhancements or 3-strike enhancements. And I made that very clear during the campaign. These are things that I wanted the public to understand, that if I were to be elected, these are the things that you're going to get from me. So obviously, because we have this unbridled discretion, which is horrendous in many cases, but in this case, I'm going to use it hopefully to do some good. We're going to stop a lot of those practices, but I want to let you know that you will have full access to our work. If you want to partner in data collection, the LA County District Attorney's Office will be your playground to learn, to experiment. I'm very open to that, because it not only does it inform my practice, but I believe that it moves the field ahead. And I look forward to actually becoming an incubator for innovation in policy development. So feel free, and as you well know, since we drive, I believe, about 30+% of the incarceration in the state. what happens in LA will have this huge impact across the state. I mean, I'll tell you some things just so that you know, kind of, you know, give you an understanding the scope of the work. We're going to start doing very aggressive resentencing, which, you know, I'm going to work with Michael, where we have approximately 240 people on death row today that I'm very committed to getting them out of death row, which will have a tremendous impact on CDCR's budget, because it's a third of the people that are on death row. Those are billions of dollars that we're talking about. So we're going to be doing a lot of stuff, but, you know, wherever I can be of help, and hopefully at some point you can help me by penal code relief, I think that that will be really welcome.
Terrific. Do other committee members have questions? Yeah, Senator Skinner.
Good morning and congratulations, DA-elect Gascon.
Thank you.
So you talked about the sentencing and how our, if I understood correctly, that our move to the indeterminate sentencing has really impacted these, you know, very long lengths of term that people are serving. So I want you to expound a little bit more about determinate and indeterminate, because I can imagine if we move to, for example, determinate, if we don't structure it properly, we could also be guaranteeing people having to serve for a specific amount of time that is also not, does not have a data-backed public safety purpose, right? So can you expand a little bit about what you think is perhaps the optimal in terms of, you mentioned also judicial discretion, what type of sentencing formulas might be optimal to achieve both public safety, well, to achieve the public safety outcomes we have in mind?
Yeah, I think that, you know, it would be important to provide greater, you know, and this is really in my own conversation with custody personnel. They say that even from a discipline stance inside the institutions, when people come in with a determined sentence, meaning they know that no matter what they do, this is how much time they're going to do, unless obviously they commit a new crime, they have absolutely zero incentive to rehabilitate or program. When people come in with indeterminate sentencing, where they know that they have a range, right? You have, and you know, I'm going to throw, you know, arbitrary numbers, but you have 5 years to life, right? Or 10 years to life. They know that there is hope that they can be there a shorter period of time if they program, which is actually more helpful for all of us, right? Because, you know, a prison term should be only a period of a cooling off period, if you will, for someone that was dangerous, and there's some level of accountability. But really the goal ought to be from day one that this person is going to be our neighbor again. And the shorter that period is, the better it is. I'll tell you something that I'd learned from the Germans that I thought it was incredibly interesting. I spent some time with German prison officials a year and a half ago. And what I found really striking was, well, there were many things that I found striking. I mean, they have open prisons, which blew my mind, but you know, I could take all this time. But the concept that when somebody was inducted or brought into the prison system, that the goal from day one was to actually make that person a better neighbor to his community or her community, meaning that from day one, they were working on the exit plan. And that the punishment that that person had was the fact that they were having their freedom restricted. They did not need to be further punished inside the prison system. So they were immediately given a tremendous amount of freedom, access to opportunities, which is completely contrary to the American way of thinking about, you know, incarceration. So I think that given the judges the ability to provide indeterminate sentencing where there is a range, where yes, there is a minimum here, but you know, depending on how well you program and what you do inside the institution, you have hopes and you can get out earlier, I think is critical. I once heard, and I truly believe this, the worst thing that you can do to a human being is take hope away. And when we send people with a lock-in time of period in prison, you take all hope away. There's nothing that they can work for. Obviously, there are some exceptional people that do exceptional things, but we should not be, you know, the average. Actually, by definition, the majority of us are average human beings. We're not exceptional. And what we have now is a system that we like to celebrate the heroes, the ones that did 20, 30 years in prison and came back and became this incredibly successful people. But we know that that's not what happens most of the time, right? So we need to really create a system around dealing with what most people are likely to be and respond to.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Sydney. You're.
Hi.
Hi.
I just had a quick question. First, congratulations. Folks in LA are very excited about this new life in front of us with you. I was wondering if you could just quickly share some ideas that you might have that we can consider legislatively that would help change the relationship between the courts, judges, and prosecutors, because that sort of trifecta really is strong and plays a huge role in how, defendants are portrayed and the pathways that they're offered. So if you have any ideas on sort of legislation that we can think about that would change the paradigm of that current dynamic.
I'm going to try to get to reality, because here's a George Gascon idealist that can go wild, and you guys would say, okay, that's all great, George, but we're not going to get there in our lifetime. So I'm going to try to get some things that I think that are achievable. I believe that overall, I think that, we've developed in the last 3 decades a system where prosecutors control the court, right? They really do by and large. We took power away from the bench. We then, by the way, unfortunately, LA County is a poster child of that. We elect more prosecutors to judges than, which I think is a real problem. Okay, I mean, LA bench is a problem to me. Not because they're bad people. It's just simply, look, if you spend 30 years, 20 years in the LA County District Attorney's Office under this culture, you're now a judge. The only difference now you're wearing a robe. I mean, I've been to some trials, and I said that poor public defender is fighting 2 DAs, the one with a robe and the one on the other side, right? So altering the dynamics of that process by reducing the, I mean, it should be a fair fight. I mean, and it's never going to be a fair fight, right? I mean, the DA is always going to bring the might of the entire government. But I think if we can create an equalizing process where the defense has a little more control over the process, and where judges get to play a more of an arbiter and have more control of the courtrooms, I think that will go a long way to start shifting the DNA. One of the things, and again, now I know I'm going to get a little bit afield, but just to illustrate the point that I really appreciated in Germany, for instance, and other countries, but I'm going to take Germany because they're more comparable to us in terms of their legal development and, economic and social makeup. The judges actually have a great deal of investigatory power, right? They're not just simply limited to what the DA is willing to bring to the table or the defense. The judges actually can direct a great deal of inquiries into what is missing in this case, or what else do we need to look for. So I think that, and I know that the Anglo-Saxon system is a little different than the system that most European nations use, other than the UK. But I think if we could start giving the bench a little more capacity on their own to be able to demand additional information, and not just simply call balls and strikes, I think that might be that might be useful. I know that most prosecutors would probably think I'm being a heretic now, but they already do anyway, so I'm not worried about it. But I think that we have to invest more in the development of our judges, which we do very little right now. We need to, I tell you, for instance, and in other parts of the world, if you decide to become a judge, you have to go through this whole process, education process. It takes 1 or 2 years of education in how to be a judge before you can even be considered to be one. Right now, obviously, they don't have the process that we have here, where you can actually run for office. They're all appointed. But the point is that by the time you hit the bench, you've had this in-depth educational process. In fact, I'll give you, and again, now I'm just to illustrate points, but in Portugal, when you go to law school, you actually decide what track you're going to go. If you decide to be a judge, you go to judge law school. If you decide to be a prosecutor, you go to prosecutor law school or others. So a judge in Portugal, generally, with very few exceptions, has never been a prosecutor. Most of the time, they were not a defense lawyer either. They were trained, they were bred to be a judge. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, by the way, but I'm just kind of illustrating things that maybe you consider. How do we lift up the professionalism of our bench, which we have incredibly talented people sometimes. They were great trial lawyers, but you know, it's much like people say, well, how can you be a district attorney if you're not a trial lawyer? And I said, you're not hiring a trial lawyer, you're hiring an executive to run a large office, right? When we're hiring a judge, we're not hiring a trial lawyer anymore, right? We're hiring a judge. Yes, you need to understand the mechanics of the courtroom because you're the arbiter, but you know, you're not going to be the trial lawyer, right? I mean, if you go to a baseball game, the umpire behind the plate, he or she might have played a little baseball in their time, but they clearly were never qualified to be a major league player, right? They got trained to be an arbiter, right? And I think that we need to get away from the concept that because you were a great lawyer, a great litigator, that somehow that makes you a good judge or a good district attorney. None of that is really the case.
Thank you.
I want to respect the DA's time, but Dean or Judge Espinoza, do you have any last questions?
I just want to say that I appreciate your coming today and addressing this group. You're right, it's a very heavy lift. We have spent a considerable amount of time talking about enhancements, the gang enhancements, the gun enhancements, and I really appreciate your comments connecting those enhancements to a reduction in judicial discretion. I will tell you, nothing more frustrating than having to decide whether to put somebody on probation to avoid a 5-year prior when probation may not be the best choice for that person. But many of us were, you know, in that situation on a daily basis. And so I'm happy to hear that you understand that very clear connection between judicial discretion and the sentencing structure that we've created here in California.
So, and
Dean?
Judge, I know that you and I are going to be talking later, and just view me as a partner in a lot of the stuff. I'm really looking forward to you having an incredible reputation in our county. I'm looking forward to being a partner to you.
Thank you.
Dean, do you have any last words?
I just wanted to say congratulations. I'm so thrilled with the results of this election and appreciate your comments very much. Look forward to working with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right, DA, thank you again. I know that there are so many other issues that you care a lot about that we've talked about that we didn't even begin to touch on: mental illness, addiction, homelessness,
Yes.
jail issues that, you know, we could spend, you know, days and days, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Obviously, you know, the election is just the first step. The hard part begins now. I think that that's true for all of us. You have a huge task in front of you. But I hope that you share what I've described as a mission to try to improve public safety. I mean, we are at historic lows, but we can still improve public safety and reduce unnecessary incarceration at the same time. You've been a leader in that, and that's certainly our mission, or at least my personal mission. And I look forward to joining you with that in the future. Thank you so much for your time and good luck. Oh, Senator Skinner has one last word. Yeah.
Yes.
I only wanted to, of course, this invitation is given to all of our folks who've come before us. But if there are specific recommendations that you or your office want to send to us in writing to consider as we develop our recommendations around the changes we will be providing either to the governor, legislature, however we do it, we welcome that. We welcome your specific recommendations.
Thank you,
More,
Nancy. And I think that
more than just welcome, we would really, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that once things settle, you know, I plan to be very active. As you well know, I was very active in the legislative arena as a San Francisco DA, and I certainly welcome that opportunity and look forward to working with you all on this. A lot of important work ahead of us.
Great.
Thank you so much, George.
Thank you.
Take office in just a few days. This isn't like the president. You have only a very short turnaround time, so your time is valuable. We really appreciate it.
And I don't have an opponent that still thinks that the election is flake, at least.
Well, yes, that's all right. Have a good day. We look forward to being in touch with you in the future.
Great. Thank you. Take
Not
care.
too
Mom.
far future.
Thanks.
All right, bye. All right. we're going to move on to our first panel of the day, but final panel of this particular hearing. Tom, if you could start promoting our panelists. Oh, there we go. Hello. All right. So good morning, everyone. Is Jay with us yet, Tom?
Yeah, I'm right here, man. I'm right here. Hey, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. Okay, yeah.
You can't see this beautiful face? Come on, man.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And Ann isn't here.
I think she is, Mike. She just
Everybody's here, Mike.
Yeah.
Ann is
Oh,
here.
okay.
Yeah, everybody's here.
I'm having, I'm just going to read I'm just going to read the script and avoid what's on my screen because it's a little confusing to me right now. All right. So now we're turning to our final panel of the day. These are leading advocates who share their thoughts with us on what the committee should consider first as our first year draws to a close. As I did yesterday, I want to give my deepest thanks to each of the panelists for sharing insights of the committee today. I also want to say that we really have we want to reserve your opening comments to 5 minutes because the most productive time that we've had with the panelists is the conversation between the panelists and the committee members. I'll raise my finger when you have 1 minute left in your 5 minutes. We've read your submissions and we really do appreciate them. So please just try to hit the high points so we can move on to the meat of our conversation. With that said, our panelists today are Ann Irwin, who I see now. Good morning, Ann, who's the director of Smart Justice California. Taina Vargas Edmond, who I also see now. Good morning, who's the executive director of Initiate Justice, and Jay Jordan, who I also now see, who's the executive director of Californians for Safety of Justice. Thank you all for joining us. Ms. Irwin, we'll hear from you first.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here among colleagues and friends. It's always great to see Jay and Taina's faces. It is an honor to be here with you all. The work that you are doing is pressing and it is overdue. I have been watching the hearings pretty diligently, and there is a consistent thread in the testimony and data that has been presented to you over the past several months. Our current practice of sentencing people to very long periods of incarceration is both counterproductive and frankly inhumane. It lacks empirical support. Its opportunity costs are far too high. It is wasting human potential. And above all else, it isn't making us safer. You have heard dozens of ideas for mitigating unjustly long sentences at both the front end through sentencing reform and the back end through parole and resentencing. Rather than spend my very brief time here reiterating those ideas from my colleagues in this work, I'd like to zoom out and share a bird's eye perspective on what's possible. Much of this is actually going to be echoing some of the concepts that DA-elect Gascon shared with us earlier. What I want to tell you is that a radically different framework for holding people accountable and changing behavior is not just a theoretical possibility. It's not magical thinking. A world in which people are serving shorter sentences, even for violent crimes, would not be experimental or pioneering. Rather, the system that California has built over the last 40 years is experimental, and the experiment has failed. Let me share a couple of examples of very different and far more effective approaches to accountability and sentencing. The first is Norway. I've chosen Norway as a contemporary example because I studied Norway and I traveled there last year along with a California delegation. Assemblymember Kamlager was with us. While in California, we focused on warehousing people, in very harsh environments for very long periods of time. Norway's penal system is built from the ground up on a set of very different, empirically backed premises. First, people are redeemable, even people who commit crimes of violence. We are fundamentally products of our environment. We deserve empathy and a real opportunity to change our lives. Second, most people can and will change their mindset and their behavior given the right support, resources, and opportunities. Finally, and this is the one that I really want to focus on, lengthy incarceration is counterproductive. Public safety depends on right-sizing sentences and making sure that what happens during the period of incarceration is productive and transformative. The North Star of Norway's penal system is to prepare people to be better neighbors, not to try to teach them a lesson by giving them the adult version of a lengthy timeout in a dark closet. In Norway, there are no life sentences. 21 years is the maximum sentence, and it's reserved for heinous homicides. The average prison sentence is 8 months long. Most non-serious offenses are not punished with incarceration. They use fines, community service, mandated treatment. So the burning question is Norway's system successful? Yes, it is. California incarcerates 8 times as many people per capita as Norway. But Norway's recidivism rate is about 20%, far better than our recidivism rate. And Norway's violent crime rate is about a quarter of California's. So while Norway is a contemporary example of a different approach to sentencing, I want to share a glimpse into a bygone era in California's own penal system. It is an unabashedly anecdotal example, and I know it well because it is my father's story. And I'm sharing it to illustrate that a different approach is buried inside California's own penal DNA. In 1949, when he was a young man, my father committed an armed robbery of a gas station convenience store in Los Angeles. As was the practice then, and I should say he was no choir boy before that offense. As was the practice then, he was sentenced to an indeterminate sentence, 5 years to life. This is 1949. My dad spent the bulk of his prison term reading, introspecting, and getting mentally ready for a very different life after prison. He was released after 5 years to the day because parole was actually normally granted then, as was intended. He worked as a waiter, graduated from UCLA, earned a PhD from UC Berkeley, and then became a tenured professor at San Francisco State. My father's fate would have been entirely different had he been sentenced and then navigated post-incarceration life in a more recent time. His crime,
Anne,
yes.
I just want to try to wrap it up just to keep it
I
short.
will.
We do want to, okay.
I will.
Thanks.
His crime would have triggered a number of modern day sentence enhancements. So he surely would have been sentenced to decades in prison. My father was able to thrive after his release because he hadn't spent a crippling number of years in prison and because he did not have an albatross around his neck when he walked out of prison. I want to help you reimagine the way we have approached accountability in California. And so for that, I'm very, very happy to be here today with you. If we have time during the conversation, I would love to talk about some more technical things, really driven by my experience as a public defender for many years, and particularly about strike enhancements and the overbreadth and disproportionality in their application. Again, thank you for the chance to weigh in here.
Thank you. That's what I was two points that I was exactly wanting to emphasize, is that we really want to get to the conversation and dig into the meat, not just on the strike enhancements, but particularly yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about parole and how to, really deal with the statute. And also, you mentioned it briefly at the end, which I should have been in the introduction, is not only are you now the director of Smart Justice, but that you spent many years as a public defender, so you really know what goes on in the courtrooms. All right, that said, Ms. Vargas Edmond, good to see you again.
Yes, good morning. Thank you all so much for having me today. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Taina Vargas Edmond, and I'm the founder and executive director of Initiate Justice. Our mission is to end mass incarceration by activating the political power of currently incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, or people like me who have incarcerated loved ones. I'm directly impacted by the prison system, where my ex-husband served 7 years inside a CDCR facility, and I did the entire 7 years with him. I will also say, full disclosure, I am a prison abolitionist, which means that I believe in abolishing the prison system and replacing it with a public safety system that is rooted in care, prevention, and restorative means of addressing harm. That being said, I have many perspectives on what this committee can do to improve the current system that we have. However, today I'm going to limit my comments to discussing what we can be doing around credit earning in our prison and jail systems. And I'm going to focus on 4 specific areas. One, I want to encourage this committee to consider standardizing good time credits to at least 50% for everybody in California state prisons and jails. I appreciate that this is something that this committee is already considering, particularly with focus on standardizing the credits that folks can earn in the state prison versus the county jails, because as you all know, there are 58 counties in California, and each jail has the ability to determine what good time credit can look like at that facility. And I think that we can all agree that having a standard to encourage hope, as DA Gascon and was just talking about. However, I think that we can go further than just making it standard. I think that we can also apply all credits to everybody's earliest possible release dates. And what I mean by that is, in the prison system in particular, there is a complicated apparatus in terms of determining when your earliest possible release date is. It depends on whether or not you have a determinate or indeterminate sentence. It depends on what your controlling offense is. It depends on whether or not you were convicted as a youth, or if you're eligible for other sentencing relief, such as elderly parole. So what I would recommend is that any credit that is earned, good time credit, educational merit credit, milestone credit, extraordinary conduct credit, rehabilitative achievement credit, whichever it is applied to the first opportunity that you as an individual have to be released from prison. To this, I will add that last year, Initiate Justice surveyed over 800 currently incarcerated people who are eligible for youth offender parole hearing dates. And I'll read some statistics. On average, their earliest possible release date, which is the current date the CDCR is applying their credits, and their youth offender parole hearing date, there is a discrepancy of 15 years. meaning that they would have to earn more than 15 years of credit in order for it to come down to their youth offender parole hearing date. So that is why we would recommend that credits actually come off of the youth offender hearing date, so that any credit that they earn advances their youth offender parole hearing date. And they can actually have a real incentive and benefit from it. I also want to note that of the more than 800 people that we surveyed, 90.5% of them are currently involved in rehabilitative or milestone credit earning programs, which would not help them unless they earn more than 15 years off of their sentence. So more than 90% of folks are participating in these programs without any real hope that it will benefit them. So I would encourage this committee to consider making it so that any credits that they earn, they can actually benefit from. The third recommendation that I have is to make all credits irrevocable, meaning that these are not credits that can be arbitrarily taken away. Currently, under the CDCR system, the only credits that are irrevocable are the educational merit credits, which is a 6-month credit for earning a college degree or high school diploma or equivalency, or extraordinary conduct credits, which are a 12-month credit for doing something extraordinary like saving a person's life, and are also given very arbitrarily. So I would recommend that if you earn credits for completing milestone programs, if you earn credits for participating in rehabilitative programs, those are credits that you should be able to keep and should not be revoked. Another reason that I believe that these credits should not be revoked is because of the fact that in CDCR's computer credit earning mechanism, they have been very clear to us that they do not want to apply or really like change credits that are revocable, because that is essentially too much work and it's too expensive for their staff to continue to have to, you know, revoke credits, replace credits, revoke them and replace them. So instead of their solution, which is just, okay, fine, we're not going to give enough credits, I would move that we make these credits irrevocable, so it reduces the amount of work and staff time and expense, but also gives people the credits that they have worked hard to earn, oftentimes with little to no incentive. And then the fourth recommendation that I will offer is to expand the criteria for extraordinary conduct credits, which are the credits that you, where you receive 12 months for saving a life or something like that. And I would recommend that we expand that to include incarcerated people who are working as essential workers during COVID. We appreciate the essential workers on the day-to-day in the free world who are working as nurses, who are working as retail workers. However, in prison, we also have essential workers who are working in the kitchens, who are working in medical, who are working as janitors and are making sure that the facilities stay clean with little to no access to PPE. So those folks are just as brave as our doctors and nurses out here. These folks are putting their lives at risk in, you know, places where the disease is running rampant, yet are receiving no recognition or appreciation for the risks that they are taking. So
I'm going to just jump in. I'm just going to jump in here. I mean, we really do want to jump into the credits. It is a very complicated area. And it's important and it's a priority for us, but I do want to save time for the conversation. I also want to give a plug. Okay, wrap up, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's my fourth recommendation. Thank you, Mike. So I encourage this committee to carefully review these 4 recommendations that I just laid out, and I look forward to talking about them more in detail. And I think the last thing that I would add is that I want to shout out James King, who's at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, who's formerly incarcerated, and Initiate Justice has worked very closely with him and Adnan at Restore Justice on some of these recommendations. So want to make sure that we give credit where it's due. Thank you for your time.
Sure, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I also want to give a shout out to the film about you and your husband. What is it called again?
The Feminist on Cell Block Y.
It's a really great insight about not only the work that he did inside, but also the relationship between people on the inside and the outside that began your testimony. Finally, we have Jay Jordan, who I have, he's been a leader, not just in California, but really across the country, with Californians for Safety and Justice and the Alliance for Safety and Justice. Mr. Jordan, we're really, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Hello, esteemed panel. And hey, Ann, hey, Taina, y'all both should be like governor and president, I swear. Tom, can you share this screen with me? I have like one thing I want to show folks. Is it?
Yeah, no problem. Here we go.
Okay, look. So this is from the CDC's website. I didn't make this up. This is literally, I go down rabbit holes every night because I got a 2-year-old and a newborn, so I can only get some solace like late at night. So I go down these crazy rabbit holes, and I'm on the CDC's website, and I see this, right? And it's essentially a roadmap to how we got to prison overcrowding. And so I want to make my remarks straight from the CDC's website, right? Obviously, love Jerry Brown, advocate for justice. He wrote he passed Senate Bill 42, which is ironic because Senate Bill 42 that Senator Skinner passed was dramatically different in intent this year. But this was like, this is why we have so many people in prison, right? And mind you, this was backed by like ACLU. This was backed by the Prisoners Guild, I believe it was, or I forget the name, right? But a prisoners' rights group back in those days, because it was, it was built as, hey, let's like get rid of racism and bias in our sentencing policy. Well, what happened was, instead of this determinate 5 years to life, which Ann's father got, we went to low, medium, high, right? And from 1977 to 1997, 20 years, the prison population exploded from about 14,000 to 155,000 people, right? And then you see, in 88, we had the gang enhancements, right? Street Terrorism Act, which, again, is another, kind of increase in the surveillance and supervision of and suppression of Black and brown communities. And then obviously we had a repeat offenders and 3 strikes law, and then a 10/20 life law. Right. So I was impacted by Senate Bill 42. I was impacted by Senate Bill 1555. I was impacted by Proposition 184 and the 10/20 life law. Right. In my case, right, I got locked up for robbery. They gave me a gun enhancement. They gave me a strike for the gun, and then they gave me first-degree robbery because I used a gun. So I got charged with a gun 3 times. Right. One of the things that we miss out on is plea bargains, right? 92% of people, it's probably like more than 92%, Mike, you'll most likely correct me, but 90+% of people in prison take a plea bargain. So I was an 18, 19-year-old kid, right? Lost in a sauce in Stockton, and I get, locked up for robbery. They tell me, I go through the proceedings, they tell me either we give you 13 years with 1 strike or 7 years with 2 strikes. Well, if the crime carries 7 years, give me 7 years. If it carries 13 years, give me 13 years. But this is what happens when you have a Uniform Determinate Sentencing Act, right? You have DAs able to mix and match these deals, stack charges, and then people end up taking long periods of time in prison, right? When, prior to these stacking of charges by the DAs, people would get 5 years for a robbery, 3 years for a robbery, get out, don't do a robbery again. Now you're getting 3 years plus 10, right? Luckily, I had an attorney. We scripted up all the money. My mom and dad took out a second mortgage on their home to pay for my attorney, right? And, my attorney said, you are either getting 12022.53 or 12022.5. And again, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 12022.53 is 10/20 life, and 12022.5 is the 3, 6, and 9. They're both sentencing enhancements, but one carries 10/20 life, other one carries 3, 6, and 9. But it's the same thing. It literally is the same thing. Because I had a paid attorney, I was able to get the 3, 6, the 3, 5, and 6, and not the 10/20 life. Again, these are straight from the CDC's website. If we're talking about getting at hard cost savings and closing down prisons, we're under 100,000 people. Prop 57 was supposed to be the permanent fix, but we never got into the inflow into prison. We're talking about how do we stop people from getting long sentences. I heard, Ann said, Taina talked about sentencing credits. if we go to a different system that says we're not going to arbitrarily pick a number, right? And say, hey, let's pick 3, 6, and 9. Who came up with that? What empirical data, says that 3, 6, and 9 is, you should get 3, 6, and 9 for a robbery? It doesn't make any sense at all, right? And so looking at, overturning and revamping the uniform determinate sentencing, looking at just repealing the gang enhancements, because that's all it's just like a, if you're black or brown living in the hood, then you're in a gang, right? Obviously 3 strikes, I don't have to say that. And then a 10-20 life law is crazy. Last thing I'll say is, look, y'all know CSJ, if you know me personally, my main mission is to get free, right? Like, I'm still not free. And the fact, I love Gavin, love the governors, but it is insane that the only person that can give me my pure citizenship back is an elected official, right? Like, and it's not fair that I have to, he or she has to tie my criminal record to their political career. When he gives a pardon, he or she gives a pardon, he or she is tying my political career, my criminal record to their career. Why do governors have to do that? It is insane. And the fact that they're the only person that can give me my full citizenship back, and I would say that, we passed AB 1076, still pops up on DOJ rap sheets, right? Expungement is not a true expungement. So obviously y'all will be seeing us this year or in 2021, with full sunsets, right? So, obviously, want to lay that out there. We are going after that in 2021, but want to lay that out there that you have about 3 million people in California with felony convictions that there's no remedy for us whatsoever. The additional, 5 million with regular records or arrest records, it still pops up on the record. Even if you get a pardon, it's just an asterisk that says you got a pardon. It's an asterisk that says you have a 1203.4. People aren't free. I'm not a full citizen. Last bit, Mike, and my 5 minutes is up. Just bought a house. Thank God, I just bought a house. My HOA is oppressive, right? They're really, really oppressive. And I found out that I can't join the HOA because of my record. So I pay a lot of money to live in Northridge, California, out the hood, right? And I can't join my HOA because of law that says they can't get insurance because I did something that had to do with stealing money, right? And that was a law that just got passed. Again, so, I'm not free. A lot of people aren't free. And the DOJ will keep my record till I turn 100 years old.
Thank you all. That I wrote down a million notes and a lot of reflections, and I'm going to kick things off. I'd like to go to you, Jay, because I don't know, freshest on the mind. So a couple of things that you said that I think that we need to reflect on generally as a committee, and then I'm going to ask you some specific question or two. So first of all, I think that the issue that you brought up that actually hasn't been discussed, I think, enough as the committee is the role of plea bargains, and that the vast majority of cases are resolved by plea bargaining. And if we just reduce the sentence for robbery or whatever it happens to be, does that really solve the problem? Because then there's another robbery that's already on the table that can result in the same exact punishment. So, it's tricky just to reduce sentences, considering that they're all, the vast majority are some sort of negotiated sentence at the end of the day, which brings, I think, you to, excuse me if I'm tracing your logic incorrectly, Jay, but so that to try to bring some sort of indeterminate scheme sort of cuts that off, right? Because if you can earn yourself out after some period of time, it helps. It doesn't eliminate, but it helps this charging around phenomenon that we would have if we just reduced individual sentences. But part of the problem, and this is what was really consumed a lot of our time in yesterday's hearing about indeterminate sentencing, is it puts a lot of responsibility and pressure on the parole board. And there are obvious concerns there, stemming back from the original problems that we had with indeterminate sentencing right in the first place, which is about subjective decision-making, arbitrary decision-making, unclear standards, and those are all probably euphemisms for racist decision-making. So I was wondering, because it's fresh on our mind from yesterday, if you, Jay, or either the three of you, but let's start with you, had specific thoughts or recommendations for if we are to move towards an indeterminate scheme, and we kind of are, let's face it, through a hodgepodge of different initiatives and laws, 55% of people in CDCR currently have an opportunity to get out early through the parole board. So all those people have some kind of quasi-indeterminate system. How can we improve that system to make it fair, more equitable, and I think probably most importantly, make sure more people can get out without endangering public safety? And as specific as possible, we'd love your thoughts, or I would.
Yeah, so I mean, one, you did trace my logic to earnings, credit, and indeterminate sentencing as it pertains to plea bargains. One quick note I like to make on plea bargains purely is that you should not, like, if a crime carries 3 years, a DA should not be able to say, well, do you want to take this 3 years right now, or if you go to trial, you get 15 years? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? That's what's happening. That's why people are forced to take these plea deals, because they're like, if it carries 3 years, let it carry 3 years. But a DA shouldn't be able to say, but if you go to trial and exercise your constitutional right to trial, jury trial in front of your peers, I'm going to give you 15 years if you do that.
We know that that's not an exaggeration. Yesterday, we had a witness who came in who said he got a 3-year offer. When he went to trial, the prosecutor asked for 89 years.
Yeah, so that's why we get I got forced into taking this because they told me 38 years, 8 months. And that comes with charges stacking. So if you limit like literally what you can give someone for a crime and not stack charges, then you limit the hammer if you go to trial. Like I'm being punished for exercising my constitutional right to a jury trial in front of my peers. So that's like, I just want to like put a pin in that yes, indeterminate sentencing, as the means to get a plea bargain, but plea bargains purely are foundational to the DA's ability to get longer sentences inside prison. Now, talking about indeterminate sentencing, the scheme for that, I mean, when you look at the way the penal code is written now with the low, middle, and high, I mean, that could potentially be a roadmap to how we solve for the scheme of credit earning, right? Which is like, hey, if you go in there and you reach these benchmarks, these milestones, you get the low term. If you don't, you get the midterm. If you go, and so there is like let's say for instance, robbery carries 2, 3, and 5. You go in there and you do what you need to do in 2 years, you're out. If you don't, you still got 3 years, you come back. If you do, but the max you can do is 5 years and you're out anyway, right? So it's built in a determinate scheme, but with levels and benchmarks you could reach that just automatically releases you based on your conduct in prison.
So Jay, I've actually had the same exact thought. Here's the question that we were wrestling with yesterday, or one of the questions we were wrestling yesterday. Are you suggesting that you would have sort of a menu of you need to do X, Y, and Z, and if you check those boxes, then you're out? Or do we have some sort of parole process where somebody's actually looking at your case, knowing who you are, being able to take into account things like mental illness and disabilities and things where the checkboxing system may not work so well? But checkboxing system works because it eliminates a lot of the subjectivity / racism, but it does also take away some of the individualized review that a parole board might have.
Let's create an algorithm. I'm joking. No algorithm. So I'm joking. So the
algorithms do better than the people in a lot of ways.
Okay, we're joking about Prop 25. I'm joking. All right. So it can be a both and, right? CC1s and CC2s are overworked and they have large caseloads, and it's just like it's difficult for them to keep up and know every single person that comes into their office. I would say like having check boxes, but those check boxes need to be based on a conversation had prior to sentencing, right? What that means is instead of a probation report, right? Someone is like saying, hey, Jay Jordan, you know, you robbed somebody at an ATM. Why did you do that? Well, I was on drugs. I was a kid and I was lost and didn't agree with my parents, half the time, right? Like if that would have been something that someone would have told me before and said, oh, okay, well, this is what you do. You get your GED, right? One, let's check that. You enroll in college, right? You get a trade, you go to anger management, right? So to your point, that needs to happen prior to the checkboxes being created for that person. So when they go in there with this is what I need to do because this is why I committed the crime. You know, and that makes sense?
No, absolutely. And we talked yesterday about making sure that those services are available, because that's obviously a catch-22 if you can't go to get your GED, but you have to get, so I get that. We are trying to keep on a tight time schedule. And I know that, Anne, you also, I think, had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor it because I think that both you and Jay are getting at what my recommendation, if I were given a blank slate and a pen, would be a
magic
hybrid
wand
system, right? Because neither system is by itself perfect, determinate or indeterminate. But if you have a hybrid system where this ceiling is determined, you will not serve more than this amount of time. But, everything underneath that ceiling is open and indeterminate and up to the individual circumstances and the work that you put into it. I think a hybrid system could work quite well. The irony, and as Jay alluded, was that the indeterminate sentence, because of the problems with back-end parole being too restrictive and arbitrary, as you all learned yesterday, it was the Prisoners' Rights Union that worked with the governor to move to a determinate sentence. They never imagined that the ceilings would then, become infinite, the most time you could serve. So that would be sort of my recommendation, is a hybrid, and there are various ways to get at that. But that having that ceiling is crucial on so many levels, at the local level during plea bargaining, making sure that our prison population doesn't balloon. There's just having a ceiling is sort of imperative.
And if I could just add something quickly to
Please.
this conversation, I think the central question that we're trying to ask is what provides hope and incentive for incarcerated people. So the solution is, indeterminate, determinate, some hybrid, but something that I would like to make sure that does not go amiss is the role of families and community and loved ones on the outside in providing hope and incentive for people to, do better while they're in prison. Programs, of course, are incredible and very necessary, but I can speak from, personal experience that the number one reason my ex-husband stayed out of trouble was not because, he was afraid of getting write-ups or anything like that. It was because he didn't want our visits taken away. It was because he didn't want to let me down. It was because he wanted to make sure that he was back home to his family. And right now, the prison and jail systems do everything within their power to make visiting and communication with their loved ones as expensive and as difficult and traumatizing as possible. I have PTSD from visiting California state facilities. So I would like to encourage this committee to also consider what can we do to ensure that families can easily be connected to their loved ones on the inside? What can we do to ensure that people on the inside still feel like they are part of their community and still feel accountable to their community, in addition to going to the programs and seeking counseling and all of those other, really effective tools.
Certainly. Do other members have questions? Senator Skinner?
Thanks. Tania, thank you for making that point, because it's not really come up in our discussion so far, but I think it is essential. And if we don't address it and we only try to address programming, it's not going to be adequate. What would be helpful, and maybe you all already have, but I would love to get, you all had very specific and concrete recommendations and that were, like 4 or 5 each. They were manageable too. If we could get those in writing, I would really appreciate it. And then Anne and Jay, my question to your comments around determinate and indeterminate, it was partly the motivation of my question to DA Gascon was trying to understand how, if we're changing sentences, how to design it so that we have, well, I didn't want to get in a situation where we guaranteed a certain long length, right? And yet we still, I mean, whatever we do has to be palatable, has to have some rooting in public safety, clearly. And so I thought, even if I take Jay's experience, like your 5 years, I'm not sure if you needed a full 5 years for the crime that you committed. And so, you know, is there a way to design this so that that we can have some, whatever, even shorter minimum times with some demonstration that the person is, as they were talking about the Norway example, ready to go home and be a good neighbor. And, you know, how, of course, how we achieve that politically is a whole different story, but just, you know, our being able, your recommendations for our being able to wrap our arms around how we can frame such proposals would be very helpful.
Can I respond to that and talk about a related and really important phenomenon about, I call it overbreath, because I think it's getting, someone is printing at the remote printers, you know, working from home. There could be, so not all robberies are created equal. So let's say we decide, or you know, there's some data that shows us, because I am with Mike 100% that we need data. How do you make this determination about what any of these decisions about the contours of the system without empirical data? But let's say there was some data that said, you know, an armed robbery, this is roughly the amount of time that the average person needs or could use, or this is the outside ceiling. You know, I want to talk about what has happened and what happens in the courtroom with robberies. And the problem that we have under the current system, and let's just assume that the 3 strikes system is here to stay and strike penalties are here to stay for the time being. They won't be because of the work of people on this call, but let's just talk about it for now. There was a time when I was a public defender where about 1/3 of my caseload were cell phone snatches. That's what they were. They were cell phone snatches. And they were being charged as robberies, 211s, which are strikes. There's no way around it. There's no 2nd degree 211. Those are strikes. And these were cases where, you know, mostly young folks were walking around San Francisco and literally taking cell phones out of people's hands. And because of the way the law is written, just a small amount of force, even a slight tug or a pull, puts it from a theft to a strike, a robbery. And what was striking to me, what was heartbreaking, actually, I have to be candid about that, is the notion that some of these young boys who were doing this could do this 3 times and be sentenced to 25 years to life. And so I got into the practice of calling the survivors, the victims of these cell phone snatches, to talk it through with them, mostly out of desperation, because I needed someone else whose voice mattered, if they were willing to weigh in and say, this is not right. And almost to a 1, when I explained to the victims that what happened to you qualifies as a strike under California's 3 strike laws, they were some level of disturbed. And some even so much so to come to court, to write letters. And I think that that highlights that in practical application, not all robberies are created equal. So if we are going to have a system that punishes certain behavior as strikes and all the things that flow from that, we must be very careful that certain conduct is not getting swept in that doesn't involve violence or a threat of violence. The other one that I will just touch on briefly is around residential burglaries, also strikes under California three strikes law. In places like San Francisco, where there are quite a lot of apartment buildings, I, again, would have lots of cases at any given time involving someone breaking into the garage of an apartment building and taking usually bikes out of the garage. Those are strikes. These are people who never came anywhere near an actual residence where anybody was, never went into the hallways where the apartment front doors were. And again, we're talking about the same phenomenon. So I would encourage you all, if you to the extent that you can, given the interplay with propositions, to look at creating degrees and to differentiating, to make sure that as long as we have a three strikes system, that penalty is only reserved for the most serious kinds of conduct and is not sweeping in conduct that does not involve those kinds of serious moments that we typically think of when we think about strikes. And again, those are two examples. There are quite a few more.
And I encourage you to stay for the later conversation, because Estes robberies and involving shoplifting are another type of robbery that carries similar consequences that we think are quite common and problematic, and are almost the equivalent of enhancements in a different way. Despite how many offenses we have in California, right? Despite how long the penal code is, there are some of these extraordinarily common offenses, robbery and burglary being probably the most two, that have sweeping applications and don't have the type of degrees or differentiations that other states have. So your point is well taken. Do other members have questions?
I have a question slightly off topic.
Oh, can Dean Richardson first and then Judge Espinoza?
Sure.
Sure. And this is going to be similar to yesterday. So I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared. And when I say similar to yesterday, for me anyway, it's been quite a struggle hearing all of this testimony and then trying to figure out what we should be doing in our role. And I say that because, of course, we have over-criminalization, we have discretion that gets exercised by every single criminal justice actor, and often that the impulse was punitive. And this gets back to what you were talking about earlier, and in that, so I don't want to sound negative, and this is why I'm going to say this, and then I'm curious about what all of your thoughts are. Because as I think about these incredible recommendations that you have about what we should do as a committee, which of course we should do, we should move in those directions. I think it's critically important that we do so. Part of me thinks that whatever we do, and this is based on history, so you think about determinate sentences, indeterminate sentences, we keep going back and forth because we're trying to address the racial bias and disparities that exist whenever you have discretion. And we all know, I think, that whenever there's discretion, that punitive impulse that we have as a society will take over. And however we tinker around the edges, because that's what I feel like we're doing, right? We're tinkering around the edges, we will be back in this same place where we are now, which is why I'm saying what I'm saying is negative, right? Because, and the reason I mentioned you, Anne, and I guess I can turn this into a question this way, it seems that one of the ways that we can attempt to change our culture as a country and as a society is to have the governing principles from which we will, and all criminal justice decision makers will approach these cases, right? So you mentioned people are redeemable. Yes, people can change, absolutely. Lengthy incarceration is counterproductive, 100%, right? And if we could somehow, and I don't know how to do this, through the penal code, begin with these governing principles and then view everything through that lens. So whether we're a judge, whether we're a prosecutor, whether we're a public defender, whether we're a social worker, whether we're a victim advocate, whoever we are, we should start from that premise versus the premise of our punitive impulse, because that's what we have, right? And Jay talked about 3 strikes, you're out, 3, 6, and 9, right? We just make those things up because they sound good, right? That's what we do. And so I'm sitting here trying to figure out, how do we get there? Because if we got there, then even when we have maximums, whether we have indeterminate or determinate sentences, right? Like we could get to the place that Norway is at. And so I guess, what are the culture? Is there any hope for that? Right? So if I think about Norway, and I don't know much about Norway, so I don't know when they get to these premises from which they start, is it because their country and their culture and their society is more cohesive than ours? They don't have the history of slavery and the centuries, or maybe they do, like I said, I don't know. And so I'm just trying to figure out, as a member of this very important, the charge that we have, how can we get there? And we have to tinker around the edges. I think we do. I think it's important. But do you have hope, I guess?
So let me tack on to that. Norway has come up many times and is a really important example. They also spend about 2 times the amount of money that we do per person on their correction system. So assuming that we can't do that, at least in the short term, are there specific reforms that you might have learned from Norway that are financially realistic in California?
Yes, but only if we continue to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated. So, we can spend more per person, which, in terms of a return on investment, which I'll just acknowledge, it doesn't feel right to say that about human beings and human lives, but just in terms of, are you getting the kind of metrics out of it that you put in? Norway's able to do that, and the society is supportive of that because there are far few people who are incarcerated. But I do want to point out, Dean Richardson, on our Norway trip, and Assemblymember Kamlager was a part of a lot of these discussions. We went on that trip with a group that included CDCR leadership, the former secretary, Ralph Diaz, wardens, CCPOA, president and vice president, some legislators. And so you can imagine our conversations where we talked through, the role of the United States' racial tragedy of a history and how much that plays a part, and really tried to test all of the different premises or explanations for why the Norway system is not possible. And while those things are true, I think you kind of hit home at a shared set of principles. And I am hopeful that we are moving toward a place where we can set a shared set of principles, at least in California. And I do want to also say about Norway, which is fascinating, they did not start off as a penal utopia. They were headed in a really difficult direction, and
Very similar to California's, in fact. That's a very good point.
At the same time, they were, their incarceration was shooting through the roof. There was a lot of violence inside the prisons. Recidivism was very high. And rather than, what we did is we doubled down on incarceration and that model. And they said, okay, stop. Let's rethink this from the very foundational principles. And that I think we can do. And if we were to do that, we would find that we can agree on some shared principles that should govern sort of every piece and every layer, from the state level to the local level, of how we do accountability and justice.
We have about 5 more minutes left on this panel. We're almost, or a little bit over time already. Judge Espinoza, I know you have a question, and Taina, it looks like you have something that you want to respond, but can we go with Judge Espinoza first, please?
Yeah, I just want to echo the first degree res Berg comment, and it was something I hadn't thought about in the context of this committee, but it's even more ridiculous the way that the way that law operates in Southern California, where we have lots of homes with attached and detached garages. So if you're walking down the street, you wander into a garage and take a bike, but the garage is detached from the home, you're charged with stealing the bike. You do that same crime and the garage is attached to the home, you're charged with first-degree residential burglary with a strike and a presumptive state prison sentence. So there has to be some way to look at that and point out the how ridiculous that law is in operation. I just wanted to say hi to Jay. Good to see you again, Jay. Many times I've heard you speak on barriers to reentry, the hundreds of barriers to reentry that exist. And a couple of years ago, you and I were having a conversation about eliminating the need for petitioning for expungement, making it more administrative at the end of a probationary period. I have to be honest, I'm not proud to admit this, but I've lost track of that conversation. What, if anything, has happened with that?
We passed it.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Good work.
Taina, I think you had a question
Yeah, it's not
or
a
a comment. Sorry.
Right. Yes, I wanted to weigh in on this conversation that we're having around our values and principles, and I think that that's really important, an important place for us to start. I think one of the key issues with our existing system is that we focus only on the culpability of the individual. When harm is caused, we look at individuals and say, are you redeemable? Do you deserve a second chance in X, Y, or Z situation? But if we could shift our values and principles towards also looking at the culpability of the system and determining whether or not a person had a first chance to begin with, or looking at how the system had failed that individual in the situation. I'm not sure. I think, Dean Richardson, you were looking to simplify an issue. I think I may be complicating it a little bit more, but that is something that I would really like us to seriously explore, because how do you look at, a child, a young person who's committed a robbery but grew up in poverty? Sure, that person is responsible for the individual choices that they made, but the system is also responsible for that child growing up in poverty and not having the social systems that they needed in place in order to not feel desperate enough to make that decision. So what I would like us all to be thinking about is, yes, let's reform sentencing. Let's increase access to credits, whether we go with more determinate or indeterminate systems, fine. But what are we fundamentally changing so that less people end up causing harm in the first place? Because it's not just about people ending up in the prison system and the costs that are incurred for our state. I have spoken with so many people who are incarcerated. Literally every single person in my immediate family except myself has been incarcerated. Nobody wants to be in those situations. Nobody wants to cause harm. Harm is caused when people are desperate, when they feel that they don't have any other opportunities. So as we're talking, tinkering away at the edges, let's also bring it back and say, what needs to be changed? What do we need to invest in people and our community so that this is happening less in the first place?
I have to respond very quickly, Chair, to say I cannot agree with you more. This was one of the topics that we discussed yesterday when we were talking about parole, which is the irony that we think about all of the programming that we can help people who are incarcerated get access to. And what a shame that we have to think about it after people are incarcerated. Why aren't we doing this more at the front end before people get into the situations? Because we as a society, we as a culture have failed people. So I just want to say I agree with you completely.
And I want to add that I agree, and Jay, I'll let you jump in here too. This is an ecosystem. It's not just the penal code system. It's an education system. It's a mental health care system. It's homelessness. Our mandate is obviously, and this is part of the problems, right? Is these siloed ideas. I think that we are trying to recognize that. And although some of the proposals that we will make may seem technical, I do think that they hopefully will begin a cultural shift. And in the long term, certainly our committee is committed towards a cultural shift. And I think that laws and norms and cultures, interact with each other. So it's complicated there. But I definitely think that we all appreciate this is a very complicated ecosystem, and that reducing a robbery from first degree to second degree doesn't address why the person's committing the robbery in the first place, which is of course what we want to avoid for everybody, right? So Jay, and then we're going to have to wrap it up unless any of the members have a last minute question, because I just want to try to keep us as on schedule as possible. So Jay?
Yeah, just really quick about the visioning. I love that question. It's like, I was asked a question the other day that blew my mind. They said, Jay, what would make you stop fighting? And I'm like, damn, I don't know. I don't know. But so the incentives, right? So those guiding principles, whatever those are, I love. Putting the system on trial, right? Is like, what did this person go through before we even get to like, why you do the crime? What did you go through? I love that. And one of the ways I think we can incentivize the system to do that, and it's perfectly in our purview, and we have precedent for it, is look at probation, right? We changed the funding formula for probation to incentivize, like, obviously, caseloads and all that's a problem, but that same theory of, well, let's not have a set formula for prisons, right? Like, why are we giving prisons $13 billion and an annual increase, even though prison populations are declining? Like, what's up with that, right? Like, we're spending $50 billion on our entire criminal justice system as a whole, and every year, but only 1% goes directly to victims, right? And so, like, the funding formulas are going to be crucially important for any major culture change. That's what you saw the foundation for Norway. They stopped and said, wait a minute, let's not fund punishment, let's fund rehabilitation. So it sucks, but it is a question around what are we funding, in terms of like not, making people into a commodity here and say, are we funding, investing in rehabilitation? But that's what it is, right? Like, it's taxpayer dollars and we are investing in punishment. So in order to have that holistic culture change, we are gonna have to say, well, no more automatic funding for bloated prison populations. We have to change this funding formula and then change the charge of probation, parole, prisons, courts. Like, success means X, Y, and Z.
I think that's absolutely right. And of course, it's appropriate that you have the last word, because Proposition 47 in some ways was a real model for that, and redirecting the funding. And of course, what I'm alluding to is that Californians for Safety and Justice were the primary sponsors, along with George Gascon. So that actually wraps up our whole morning. Senator Skinner.
Yeah, just a couple
Speaking of
things.
budgets, by the way, as the budget chair.
Yes, well, the 13 billion is it's a absurd amount of money, but we've never really calculated the full cost of all of this, because when we think about the damage to the families and then the neighborhood, by removing people from that family, just all of the damage and all the cost inherent to that damage. And then of course, when we return, we've talked about the support, this guiding principle of, what caused the person in the first place, say, but then even when we release people, we've in effect set them up for recidivism, because we have, as Jay pointed out, they've got that tail, that albatross around their neck. It's so much more difficult for them to get jobs. And in an economy like this, I mean, I'm very, very proud that we're down to the lowest number of incarcerated individuals in our state prisons since 1990. However, all of the folks that we have fortunately given in effect the second opportunity to, we let out at a time when we have a pandemic and our economy's gutted. So that we would, whatever, I mean, it's just like a setup. But I don't mean to be editorializing. I know these are all the things we have to focus on. So my couple of questions. One, I look forward, Jay, to whatever is going to be recommended regarding the expungements, only because I know from carrying legislation myself that even with the most recent one we've done, that none of our expungements are really true, complete expungements. People still have that tail. So, and I think we have to rethink that. So I look forward to it. But I want to ask this question to everyone. Obviously we're talking about changing sentencing, and we will do that, but we will have, we may not, I mean, we're going to have limitations, right? So what else can we do, for example, to incentivize DAs not to send people to prison?
I wrote this in it's a great question, Senator Skinner. And, it gets at, we may not, so we heard from DA-elect Gascon this morning, and he has an ideology that is quite different from most elected DAs currently in California, and certainly line deputies that are working for them across California. So if you cannot win the hearts and minds of district attorneys, then let's incentivize them to lean on something other than state prison as a resolution for a case, I would urge this committee to look at something similar to SB 678, but for district attorneys, and figure out financial incentives, whether it's grant-based or other financial incentives for them to pursue more non-prison resolutions, but also in the realm of resentencing, right? You can provide financial incentives to district attorneys to reopen those cases, as you heard a lot about yesterday, but 1170 D1. So it's a great system where you don't have to rely on changing the hearts and minds of district attorneys, and you can instead sort of speak to their bottom line budgets.
And I would just
Others
add,
have- Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I just want to add, I think that we should also be offering alternatives that are outside of the punitive justice system. Right now, DAs often, like, the only alternatives that they have are probation or county jail. So I think that we should just also be exploring what are some community-based organizations that can be providing services, restorative justice-based organizations that can be providing services. The more that we expand the breadth of the alternatives and opportunities that we have, I think that we can be incentivizing district attorneys to pursue options outside of sentencing people or pursuing state prison sentences.
Jay?
The reason is just like, they're elected, right? And they're elected on what? Like, Gascon got elected on, a different set of principles that Los Angeles espouses, voters in Los Angeles espouse, right? Chester got elected on a different set of principles that San Franciscans espouse, right? Like, so, it's difficult to incentivize. You can incentivize a DA, but if their bottom line is their budget, but their bottom line is also voters, right? It's like, and so it's hard to incentivize DA to do something different if the people who elected them want them to punish. And so there is this, this non-legislative work that needs to happen around narrative shifting in this state. And that could come from the top, right? And say, we as a state, and it could come from this and say, we as a state are no longer going to invest in this failed system of punishment because it has not worked. It does not, give victims the support they need. It does not, give us the public safety that, it's supposed to. So we're going to go to a different system, and DAs, come with us. Like, this narrative shifting in the hearts and minds. And we've seen this with the failure of Prop 20. 51 out of 58 counties. These were Trump-leaning conservative counties that voted no against tough on crime. And so there is like this, yearning for, hey, don't spend my money. And I arguably say Prop 25 failed because of one of the components was the cost, right? It costs too much money. People are not fooled by spending more money for punishment. And so they're, again, I love the idea of these guiding principles being rooted in budgets and incentives for something different and moving away, because DAs will be like, hey, the voters are saying something different, so therefore I have to act different. And I think that behavior is going to have to be changed through what voters say they want in terms of DAs.
So I often wonder whether just not electing DAs, judges, and sheriffs, and I don't know if anybody's done the research or if they even can, whether just the elimination of that as being an elected office for any one of them or all three of them, how much that might change these outcomes without even changes to sentencing and such.
Now you're speaking the language. That's exactly what I will follow up with. I'll have my folks follow up with your office, because that is exactly what we've been looking at, is how do you take the political incentive out of public safety? Because when you have political incentive in public safety, it doesn't matter about, like what's right. It matters about what's ideological and what's going to get them reelected. So you're definitely on the right track there.
Well, first of all, thank you all. We will be in close contact with all of you. Jay, one of the things that we didn't get to that I know is important to your work is voices of victims in this criminal justice reform movement. We did have Crime Victims United come speak to us at a previous meeting, but we also recognize that they're not the only voice of victims. And I really do appreciate that you guys work, and it's not enough of what we got to talk to you about today. We're always short on time. These conversations are always terrific, but we will be in touch. Thank you. The more specific any future recommendations that you guys might have for us, the better. I appreciate the cultural issues that you guys are trying to get at, and we are generally on the same page. The good news is, and I think the votes in California show this, is I think the voters also support these general cultural shifts. The hard part is, how do you change the specific language in the statutes to effectuate and advance those cultural values? It's not, so that's kind of where a lot of my head is, and a lot of the detailed work that our staff is working on. So that would be extremely important to us. So with that, I'm going to close this meeting. I have to take a slightly longer break than usual. I'd like to come back at 11 a.m. to begin, which is in about 12 minutes, for our the following part of our hearing. Thank you, Jay and Tania. We will be all in touch with you guys.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.